are going to talk about the Internet of Things. We've had a lot of rich conversations about AI. It obviously depends a lot on data, and there's a close connection to IoT, and often people conflate AI and IoT a bit. So we're going to demystify IoT and look toward the future about what we should be talking about that perhaps we're not. I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. And while you do you mind saying what you think is misunderstood about IoT?
So good afternoon, everybody. Tom Bianculli. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Zebra Technologies. And Zebra's in the business of creating barcode reading equipment, really visibility solutions, mobile computing, barcode reading, RFID equipment that helps power business, helps power the supply chain. Basically everything we're seeing that's been spoken about in terms of leaps in transportation that are getting goods from point A to point B and being able to provide the visibility that our customers need to get the track and trace and actually make that delivery happen on time, every time. In terms of what's, I don't know if I'd call it misunderstood, but the way I'd sort of frame up the differentiation between IoT and artificial intelligence and machine learning is that the data created by IoT is the natural resource that powers artificial intelligence and machine learning. So although AI and ML have been around for really for a long time, it's mostly been operating on what relatively static data. And what IoT is giving us now is real-time data, in-the-moment data, that's helping customers make better decisions by the second. And those that are taking advantage of that reality and that opportunity, I think we're seeing them power ahead and outpace their competition. So yeah, one way to think about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Brenna.
Good afternoon. I'm Brenna Berman. I'm the Executive Director of an urban innovation lab called the City Tech Collaborative. So we focus on bringing multiple partners together, be they large corporations, small startups, universities, and cities themselves, together to solve some of the really tough challenges that our cities are facing today, be that climate change, traffic congestion, things like that. And many of the solutions that we develop for the market are IoT-based solutions. So I loved your differentiation. That was great. I think one of the things that I might add to that that's misunderstood about IoT is that the implementation of enterprise IoT solutions somehow should follow different rules than we previously followed in enterprise implementations, that the architecture is somehow different than the architectural rules that we had to follow. So I spent 6 years as an operational CIO for the city of Chicago. I know complex, messy, old architectures. All the things that you need to follow to scale a solution at enterprise is true for IoT. And we need to go.
So just so I understand, are people trying to cut corners in IoT, or how did this come up in your previous role?
I don't know that they're trying to cut corners. I think as we move from lots of pilots to enterprise, there's this idea that somehow IoT solutions are different than previous enterprise solutions, even like ERP solutions or something, and they're not. You just need to integrate it to your operational enterprise architecture and address the same challenges and issues you do with other solutions to define the value that you're going to get from all of that data.
Okay, got it. So it's held out as a class of its own when it's not. Okay, excellent. Kevin.
And good afternoon, I'm Kevin Sternikert, and I lead innovation strategies at JDA Software. And our company supplies software to world companies for their supply chains and for retailers, manufacturers, and wholesale 3PLs. And I think probably the biggest misconception is that there's a choice that companies have of whether they will use IoT and AI or not. I think in the age of the hyper-competitive environment that we're in today, it's a mandate that companies need to begin to understand what's happening in the world around them more than just the data that's inside of their own building from transactions that they're able to monitor and manage. And decision makers are expected to be able to deliver personalized experiences for their customers, be they other companies or consumers, and it's impossible for them to make the types of decisions that will be rewarded in a personalized way. So it's not really a choice, but it's a journey, and how do you get there, and what are the approaches that you'll use that'll be successful?
I mean, IoT has been hugely hyped for years now. What percentage of what's possible are we actually seeing in implementation? I mean, the expectations are so high, but it strikes me that people are either thinking about this, again, intimidated and consider this, as Brenna was saying, in a class of its own, or are not implementing it correctly, or are in the early stages, or maybe we see some who have been very successful, but I'm curious to get everyone's take on kind of where we are right now, and is the glass a quarter full, 3/4 empty? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So I can start off. So I would say, as you said, it's been hyped for a while, and 3, 4 is much. It's been around for a long time, obviously, but of course. But 3 or 4 years ago, I think IoT was talked about a lot in a very horizontal fashion, right? So it was. Internet of Things, you've got to go connect your assets. And it was really lacking in the conversation was what's the reason why, right? So what problem am I actually solving? So there was a lot of discussion around connectivity for connectivity's sake, getting that data, feeling like I'm behind if I'm not gathering the data. And that, I think, has shifted really in the last couple of years to what are the verticals, the context I would put it in for our business, what are the vertical use cases and problems we're actually targeting and solving with that IoT connectivity. So by way of example, location is an area that's really important for us and provides value to our customers, being able to locate people, being able to locate assets, being able to provide context and condition around those assets. So what is it, where is it, how is it? And a real world use case there would be where we would work in partnership with somebody like JDA in leveraging their ERP capability is in a cross-dock facility where you've got fork trucks moving around. These are fork trucks that are unloading pallets from trucks. They're breaking those pallets down. They're redistributing them onto the other side of this cross-dock facility for transport to their end destination where those goods will be sold. So think about product coming in from a manufacturer, that product being broken down and then sent to a DIY retailer that where you would go buy that product individually. The fork trucks in that facility have about 50% utilization because they're loading in a point-to-point fashion. So they're picking up those pallets, they're moving them to a doctor, or they're coming back with no load on the fork. So we've instrumented all those fork trucks. We've instrumented all the pallets with RFID tags. We've used ceiling-mounted infrastructure. So we've turned all of the pallets and the fork trucks into IoT endpoints. And as a result of doing that, we know where every one of them is at every moment in time, and now we can route optimize those fork trucks and take that utilization from 50% to over 80%. And that's solving a problem, right? That's driving better utilization, lower cost, reducing errors, making sure the right shipment gets to the right place. And so now it's not a discussion about IoT because I'm connecting, but it's a mandate to go and deploy that for me to compete effectively. Because if my competitor has that capability and I don't, that's not going to leave me in a very good position. So I think the shift from a technology discussion and a horizontal discussion to the vertical use cases that have real ROI is the big shift we're seeing now.
Okay, excellent. And Kevin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's those use cases that are really driving further investments, right? Just knowing where something is at is not going to solve the challenges of the day. In supply chains, it's important to be able to pre-position and to be able to know where things are at in that journey because you might need to reroute. And in a commerce environment where decisions are made on the moment, in the now, products change destinations en route because there's a higher priority or a reason why something needs to be in a different location. In the way things were done 5 years ago, you'd have to wait until the night for the batch to run to be able to understand where everything's at. And that would mean that things would follow their journey. You would waste that journey because you really wanted to go somewhere else, but you couldn't really do anything about it until you updated your information. And now, because you know where everything is at and you understand the change of need of now, you can actually reroute now and save that journey that didn't need to happen to begin with, right? And so it's these use cases that you speak of that really are driving the investments that we see companies making to leverage IoT and to leverage artificial intelligence that drive the value that companies need. An example, Amazon today does what is called predictive shipping. So they'll ship products to Chicago 15 days in advance of a customer actually ordering the product because they know tomorrow 5 people are going to order this printer And so they'll just ship it. But they did it 15 days in advance, and they paid shipping rates of 15 days in advance, which are $6 or $7 a package. But if the customer orders the product from Staples or someone else that isn't doing that, they're paying $60 or $70 to get that package to the customer in a day or two. And it's this understanding of where things are at and the way that it can be leveraged that allows companies to take advantage that drives real ROI. Because if you can ship something for $6 versus $60, the equation changes real fast.
And this example is an example of predictive analytics, right? Not necessarily IoT, correct?
But it's combined with IoT because you had to know where things were at in order to be able to leverage it
Right.
as you go. And then, if Amazon shipped it 15 days out and something changed, they could reroute before it ever ended up in its original destination to position it in a place where it would be better suited for the customer.
How are we seeing sensor technology evolve? I mean, I think that it's a really interesting area that doesn't get as much attention. Brenna, is that something you wanted to talk about?
I mean, sensor technology is evolving a lot from, the use cases obviously drive here. I think that there's a perception because so many of us are wearing commercial sensors, right? Personal sensors around the way. I think we all have one on at this point of some kind. But in the urban space, certainly, right? As cities mature, or and I don't mean just sort of cities as a government or as the customer, but outdoor sensors. I think there was this idea that they were ready to go, and that actually wasn't true. And actually, we're partnered on a project, right, called the Array of Things, which for those of you that are Chicagoans should be really proud of this, right? This is the first enterprise-scale urban sensing project of its kind that's going to collect in-depth behavioral data about the city of Chicago, so environmental data, traffic data, pedestrian counts, things like that. And I think it's probably a bit surprising to most people that we didn't know that. It's not that we just didn't know it about Chicago. We don't know that about any city, right? There's actually one environmental scientific grade temperature sensor in the city of Chicago, and it's in the middle of downtown. And we all know that if you move 2 blocks, the temperature changes 5 degrees. And part of that is because sensors out in the wild actually degrade really quickly, and that's a hardware problem that hadn't been solved yet, and it actually took, and this is a project done in partnership between the City of Chicago, the University of Chicago, Argonne Labs, Zebra, AT&T, and a couple of other companies that set out to solve the problem of actually putting sensors out into the outside environment for 5 years or longer. Because that problem hadn't been solved yet. Now, we're not entirely sure it has been solved, by the way, but the experiment's now at least running, and we think we got it solved, but it took us 4 years to get that hardware properly designed and manufactured.
Did either of you want to add to the sensor question about what kind of breakthroughs we've seen?
I just, less about the sensor itself, but more about the interoperation of the sensor. So playing a little bit off of the IoT, the predictive nature of shipping, as Kevin mentioned, and pointing to just by, you were actually seeing what Amazon paid for Ring. This is what I mean by the interoperation, right? So a doorbell that's got a camera and the ability to unlock your door going for, $1 billion. North of that in terms of valuation, probably none of us would have really thought that. And that's because of the way all that's being stitched together. Another great example there is what DHL and Audi are doing in Europe, where go back to IoT and predictive shipping, they're doing a trial now where they're delivering to your trunk of your vehicle. So we're seeing the personalization that's been spoken about on MainStage going from, it's not about delivering to an address, it's about delivering to a person. Much like the way mobile telecoms has evolved. Nobody talks about, at least nobody, probably under 40 or 50 talks about calling a phone number or calling somebody's house, right? They talk about calling the person. And so we're seeing that in the supply chain. It's not, don't deliver to my address, deliver to where I am. And so working with Audi, DHL, if you give permission as the owner of the vehicle, DHL can track the location of your car. They can arrive in the parking lot where your car is located. They've got an API that they've securely worked out with Audi, DHL has. They can unlock your trunk, place the package in your trunk, shut your vehicle, you come out of work, and you drive home. You do the last mile delivery yourself in your car, and you've got the convenience of not having to go to a locker or find out that you've got to go to the local facility to pick it up because you weren't at the destination they had on file, but it was delivered to you. So I think the fabric of them all working together is the probably the bigger advantage we're seeing now as opposed to, the technology associated with any one.
There's been so much conversation, and even in the agriculture session that we just had, about preparing data and making sure you have enough data to even think about creating any kind of AI algorithm, machine learning algorithm, or AI system. Is there a possibility that there's too much data to make sense of, or is it always the line more is more?
I think it's interesting because you can get to a place where you have a lot of noise, and you have to be able to understand how to navigate through the noise. But sometimes you don't know what really is valuable data versus noise until you've evaluated it. Much like what Watson is doing with medical records, right? It's learning about what things within those medical records help understand diagnoses and treatments versus what things are noise. And so one of the beauties of having a combination of IoT with AI is that you don't necessarily have to worry about what's noise versus what's valuable data. The machine learning capability understands and is able to decipher the difference. And in some cases, for a purpose, data might be considered noise. But maybe you have a different purpose, and that same data that was noise for one now becomes very valuable and is a contributor to the result of another. And so trying to predetermine what's noise versus data is probably not the best thing to do, because you may not understand what data really contributes to behaviors or not, especially when we're looking at trying to understand human behavior, because we can see certain things, but we don't necessarily see everything. And so our approach as we think about innovative uses of data is to collect everything we can possibly collect and let the machine, let that artificial intelligence understand, interpret, and decide what signals to pay attention to and which signals they should discard as noise, and for that purpose, ignore.
I think depending on the circumstance, though, collecting the data can be expensive.
Oh, certainly.
So a little bit, because we have people who come to us and say, we just want to get all the data. And I'm like, well, one, once you have it, you have some responsibilities and decisions to make too, and getting all the data can be expensive. So we're actually working on a project now around the waste management supply chain. And we are actually going to, for the pilot, censor everything we possibly can around about a 3-block stretch from, we have like the smartest garbage truck in the world, from cameras and sensors all over all the different parts of the truck, and then sensors all along the route from the garbage cans to where the can actually is, like the spot on the pavement, et cetera, and all these other spots. Sensors in the can in the kitchen, it's all the parts that you can, yes, I know this is a lot about trash. We talk about trash a lot in the office. So we know we are over collecting, but we don't yet know what data matters. And we have 10 defined use cases along the waste management supply chain, from different types of recycling, et cetera. And through this pilot, we'll hopefully be able to define for the partners that are working on this which data actually delivers value for that use case. And that will drive product development paths for them, for the sensors that they'll actually take to scale, and which ones that they won't because of the expense of doing that. So they're trying to make some smart decisions around which sensors make sense in that particular industry, partially because of the cost itself of gathering the data, but also because once they have that data, they are then responsible for determining the ownership model and the security models, et cetera. So, holding data isn't free.
Brenna, I'd love it if you talk a little bit more about smart cities. During lunch, one of the questions I asked was is there a poster child that we should think of for a smart city? And the consensus was not necessarily yet. But I'm curious, if we looked at, if it was IoT specifically, what should we be aware of? And what does the avant-garde look like?
Yeah, I don't think I'd love to see one if there's a poster child. I mean, there are some cities, if you want some examples, doing really interesting things. Barcelona's long been a leader, whether you're talking about IoT or not. Specifically around IoT, Amsterdam is one of my favorite cities just because they're so open around the partnership development ecosystem that they'll allow. And as a former city CIO, there is part of me that cringes and thinks this is a bit crazy, but then the entrepreneur in me thinks this is amazing. So it's a little bit like, white devil, red devil kind of thing. But the CIO of Amsterdam, a guy named Gerard Baron, has opened up the city network to allow the public to put IoT devices on the city network. I find that a little crazy, but
From a security perspective.
a little bit. But it's like the IoT version of open data, and it's generating some really amazing use cases and opportunities in their city for the things that they're learning about what residents would do and change about their city, and it's pretty amazing. So that's one example specifically in the IoT space. That's actually pretty interesting.
So I had a question about that. As we're thinking about smart cities, there's regional differences about what people are willing to permit, right? So in Germany, there's not a whole lot of
No permission at all.
no permission at all. There's a certain degree of permission that I like to give because there's a certain benefit that I get back, right? But how does a resident get to have a vote
Yeah.
in what is being tracked and whether or not they agree that that's okay,
Right.
and that they fully understand the benefits? For example, there was a city that was predetermining where to position police because of the likelihood of crime.
Lots of cities do that.
Yeah, and recently, the city I'm talking about decided they wanted to shut that down because the residents felt that was adding a bias that they didn't agree with. And so the
And they
residents...
probably didn't understand whether or not there was bias in the model or not.
Probably not, right. But to the point, what role does the city and the resident have in this idea of creating a network? So in business, right, so we agree, we want these things, our partners want these things because there's an ROI that we're going to
And
drive
customers
to.
can opt out, like by
Yeah,
definition,
exactly.
right?
But in some cases, like in the middle of an urban center, they're not able to opt out of being watched or whatever.
So you've just very eloquently described one of the biggest problems of building a smart city or managing that issue. So there are cultural differences between cities around privacy and security, and you can see them like the Array of Things project that I talked about, which does have interesting privacy elements because there are cameras in the sensor array, and they're still cameras, but. And that was the first time the city of Chicago took on building a privacy policy. So I can talk about the approach we took here to get public buy-in to that project. And there was a similar effort in Seattle, where Seattle has a very, very tech-savvy level of engagement. Just think about the two companies that populate Seattle. That's a much higher level of tech-informed engagement than we have in Chicago just because of the population differences. And then move over to New York, where just because of the culture of New York, they have cameras, public cameras, all over the place in New York, and they don't seem to care, to be honest. And their focus on privacy policies for municipal projects is increasing, but nowhere near what it is here and nowhere near what it is in Seattle, or frankly in San Francisco. Cameras are not allowed, public cameras. So things are different. And Europe is completely different, and we're seeing actually privacy policies develop through the EU, which are going to be very interesting for us all to deal with in the world of IoT, et cetera. And you can't opt out, which is, if something's in the public way, as a resident of that city, you can't opt out. So it's a challenge, and I don't know that there's any one answer. I think that the right answer is, as a professional who's developing solutions for this industry, or as a public official who is involved in the implementation of those solutions, having a very proactive public engagement model is the answer, and that has to include the education of your population around what IoT solutions are, the data that they're collecting, and basic information, and this is my biggest worry about IoT and AI in general, basic information about your rights as an individual to your data, which is the biggest problem that we should be worried about in this entire sort of overall conversation. And that's a tall list. We do quite a bit of that here in Chicago, and we're only touching the tip of the iceberg. because you need to have an informed citizenry for them to opt in and opt out. And I imagine if they had done more education, or I would hope if they had done more education in that city around your policing example, they actually probably would have made a different decision.
Yeah, you would hope, right? Because the benefit seems to be clear, right?
Yeah. Or they might have made the same decision, but for a more informed reason.
Right.
It's interesting because the same thing applies in an enterprise context as well, right? So, you take an Amazon Go or variants thereof, and I put that in a store, and I'm creating a frictionless checkout experience, which is great. I don't have to go through the checkout line, but now you sort of know what I put in my basket, you know what I took out, you know how long I dwell somewhere, you know who I am. And there's a myriad of examples like that, even around workflow efficiency, where you're tracking workers really for the purpose of their benefit, not for the purpose of just tracking them. And so we've kind of adopted this notion of, if you're starting with how you're doing something for someone as opposed to someone, right? So and I think this goes to your point, Brent, around the education. When you're starting up front with the worker saying, hey, yeah, we're going to put a camera at your dock door, but the reason we're doing that is because of these, this is what it's your point, Kevin, these are the values that it represents and the benefit it's providing to you, for you, I should say, and not something that is being used against you,
Well,
right?
isn't it
And
that-
starting with that first as the proposition, as opposed to last, and hoping people figure it out on their own.
But in the workplace context, isn't a lot of it ultimately in the interest of the employer? It's to judge whether you show up on time, it's to judge whether you're a productive team, et cetera, et cetera. So you can make the point that what's in your interest, what's in my interest might also be in your interest, but ultimately isn't it in the interest of the employer?
I don't think those two things need to be at odds. I mean, in a lot of the enterprise examples that we come across, and again, it really depends how you use it as a carrot or stick, right? I mean, is it a training moment? Right, or is it an opportunity to take action against someone, right? It's, so using that data to say, I'm going to, the 10,000 workers I have loading dock doors every night at a transportation facility, I'm going to take the person that represents the best work methods, and I'm going to attempt through the right management and understanding of what everybody else is doing to bring people up to that level, right? Now, of course, that's got the benefit to the company from a corporate perspective, but if that worker's taking more pride in their work, they're doing a better job. And then even this gets into a related field of gamification. We're seeing that as well, where workers are getting democratize the data. So my performance is seen relative to the performance of others, and I'm sort of competing with my peers in performance, and then change the pay model to pay based on that performance.
Who are we seeing do that at this point?
I mean, in the shipping industry, it's some of it's heavily unionized, but there are segments where, or shipping or picking would be another one. So think about a warehouse facility where you're picking. Are you getting paid by hour, or are you getting paid by the pick? And it's probably mutually beneficial to pay by the pick, because you're going to get probably more out of that worker. They're going to take more pride in what they're doing. And by the way, they're going to be looking for every advantage they can get to increase, their performance in a way that's constructive, right? So,
Kevin?
Yeah, and I was, if you stop by Zebra's booth, they talk about how they work with the NFL. And I bet that over time, NFL contracts are going to be reflective of what they're seeing in the performance of the players, right?
Ooh, I'm writing a use case about the NBA, and you might not say that once you read that, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot. That gets down to the data ownership. That gets really tricky.
Yeah, it does. But I think, you can also say, I'm measuring performance, I just have better ways to measure it. I've always been measuring performance, right? I've been doing it for a long time, Moneyball, right? And I pay for performance, and I put people on the field who are the best performers, not necessarily the people who score the most points, right? I think the other thing, to your point, Tom, which I think is really important, is letting the community know what you're doing, whether it's a business community or a population of residents, what you're doing and why you're doing it. Part of the story of this police department is they didn't tell anybody that they were doing it. And so when people didn't know that they were being looked at and measured and tracked, and then it was kind of, the cat was out of the bag, that's what caused a lot of problems. And so I think proactively making sure people understand, why are we doing this? What are we doing? Then it can be accepted in better ways than if you do it by surprise.
I Oh, sorry, Brenna, last word, and then I want to open it up for questions, actually.
I was just going to say I would go even one step further than letting them know. Ask them about the project and get their engagement, because when we were getting ready to put the array of things up with the cameras, we were mostly, frankly, out of engagement from the ACLU and the EFFF, and I think the general understanding that we were going to get pushback against the cameras. And we had also agreed, like one of our operating principles was, because they go up in clusters in neighborhoods, that if any neighborhood pushed back kind of collectively as to not wanting them, we would move on. But when everyone we heard from, there were questions about what were going to be done with the images, how they were protected. There were questions, but we were surprised that most communities actually wanted more cameras, wanted to know if they could get access to the images in the case of like a safety issues or something. We got very little pushback in terms of, we don't want to be watched. They didn't mind being watched, because the people who came to they weren't doing anything wrong. They wanted to know if they could use the images for their own protection when someone else was doing something wrong to them. So we learned something in that, which was, you actually don't know what people are thinking, you should ask them.
Hi, my name is Andrew Walcher. I'm with Qualcomm. One of my questions is about, clearly with inference, we have to determine, particularly with IoT, we have to determine where it's taking place. So is it going to be happening, from what you've seen, is it mainly being happening in the cloud right now, or have you started to see more inference towards the edge?
Was there an intro to your questions? Just computing in general at the edge, or?
Just for general IoT, for use cases that you've seen employed so far, have you seen it taking place more in cloud or edge at this point?
More and more pushing out to the edge for almost everything we're doing.
Yeah, that's definitely where we're at. In fact, we have an entire focus of strategy around the edge and identifying how we address that in better ways, how we understand it in better ways, and how we leverage it more fully.
I was just going to, in sort of in a cute way, just say yes, which is we're just it's sort of like, yeah, it's happening. It seems to be happening everywhere, and OpenStack in particular. If you're tracking what's happening with OpenStack, it's deploy compute, in the cloud, deploy compute on-prem, and deploy compute at the edge. And some of our use cases are direct to cloud, where it's just small, it's relatively small amounts of data. But in the case of video, do you want to be sending all of the video back to a cloud instance, which you probably can't do for bandwidth reasons and everything else, or maybe just the metadata that represents an event? Think about, sending a static image of a street corner is probably not particularly useful, sending every one of those frames back, but a sequence of things occurring in that frame that you can detect at the edge creates a meta event that you do send back. So I think, we're seeing that pretty much across verticals, that, more and more, again, in an enterprise context, CIOs are thinking that way of deploy compute across all three.